Welcome to NFL Overdrive 2015. My name is John Ray Rice and I will be your host for today's video. Today we are going to talk about the NFL season as of right now, excluding last night's game. So far this season we have seen 7 overtime games in which only one has resulted in a touchdown. Dallas at New Orleans, October 4th. So far, 2 teams. One sec. Yeah. Two teams have had 2 overtime games so far. Those 2 teams being Baltimore and Seattle. There has been, until last night's game, 3,562 total points scored, which would be an average of 46 and 20/77ths of a point per game. 814 points is the margin, with the average being 10 and 44/77ths, or 10 and 4/7ths. The Arizona Cardinals have scored the most amount of points this season at 190. The team that has allowed the most is Tampa Bay with 148. We will now discuss the schedules. The remainder of the Arizona Cardinals schedule looks pretty good. Let's hear now. At Pittsburgh versus Baltimore, at Cleveland, followed by a bye week. At Seattle versus Cincinnati, at San Francisco and St. Louis versus Minnesota, at Philadelphia versus Green Bay and Seattle. The Atlanta Falcons schedule. The remainder is after last night's game at New Orleans, at Tennessee versus Tampa Bay, at San Francisco, open date, versus Indianapolis, versus Minnesota, versus Tampa Bay, versus Carolina, versus Jacksonville, at Carolina, and at New Orleans. Baltimore is at San Francisco, at Arizona, versus San Diego, followed by a bye week, versus Jacksonville, versus St. Louis, at Cleveland, at Miami, versus Seattle, versus Kansas City, versus Pittsburgh, at Cincinnati. Buffalo Bills versus Indy, versus, my bad. Okay. Let's hear now. Buffalo Bills remainder is versus Cincy, at Jacksonville, bye week, versus Miami, at New York Jets, at New England, at Kansas City, versus Houston, at Philadelphia, at Washington, versus Dallas, versus New York Jets. Carolina Panthers remainder is at Seattle versus Philadelphia, Indianapolis, and Green Bay, at Tennessee versus Washington, at Dallas, at New Orleans versus Atlanta, at New York Giants, at Atlanta versus Tampa Bay. Chicago Bears, their remainder is at Detroit, bye week versus Minnesota, at San Diego, at St. Louis versus Denver, at Green Bay versus San Francisco versus Washington, at Minnesota, at Tampa Bay versus Detroit. Cincinnati is at Buffalo, bye week, at Pittsburgh versus Cleveland versus Houston, at Arizona versus St. Louis, at Cleveland versus Pittsburgh, at San Francisco, at Denver versus Baltimore. Cleveland Browns versus Denver, at St. Louis versus Arizona, at Cleveland, at Pittsburgh, bye week, versus Baltimore, Cincinnati, San Francisco, at Seattle, at Kansas City versus Pittsburgh. Dallas Cowboys, bye week, at New York Giants versus Seattle versus Philadelphia, at Tampa Bay, at Miami versus Carolina, at Washington, at Green Bay versus New York Jets, at Buffalo versus Washington.
That's scary, right?
Denver Broncos, at Cleveland, bye week, versus Green Bay, at Indy versus Kansas City, at Chicago versus New England, San Diego, Oakland, at Pittsburgh versus Cincinnati, at San Diego. Detroit versus Chicago versus Minnesota, at Kansas City and London, bye week, at Green Bay versus Oakland, Philadelphia, and Green Bay, at St. Louis, at New Orleans versus San Francisco, and at Chicago. Green Bay versus San Diego, bye week, at Denver, at Carolina versus Detroit, at Minnesota versus Chicago, at Detroit versus Dallas, at Oakland, at Arizona versus Minnesota. Houston, at Jacksonville, at Miami versus Tennessee, bye week, versus Cincinnati, at Cincinnati, versus New York Jets versus New Orleans, at Buffalo versus New England, at Indy, at Tennessee versus Jacksonville. Indianapolis versus New England versus New Orleans, at Carolina versus Denver, bye week, at Atlanta versus Tampa Bay, at Pittsburgh, at Jacksonville versus Houston, at Miami versus Tennessee. Jacksonville versus Houston versus Buffalo and London, bye week, at New York Jets, at Baltimore versus Tennessee versus San Diego, at Tennessee versus Indianapolis versus Atlanta, at New Orleans, at Houston. Kansas City Chiefs at Minnesota versus Pittsburgh versus Detroit and London, bye week, at Denver, at San Diego versus Buffalo, at Oakland versus San Diego, at Baltimore versus Cleveland versus Oakland. Miami Dolphins at Tennessee versus Houston, at New England, at Philadelphia, at Buffalo versus Dallas, at New York Jets versus Baltimore versus New York Giants, at San Diego versus Indianapolis versus New England. Minnesota Vikings versus Kansas City, at Detroit, at Chicago versus St. Louis, at Oakland versus Green Bay, at Atlanta versus Seattle, at Arizona versus Chicago versus New York Giants, at Green Bay. New England at Indianapolis versus New York Jets, Miami, Washington, at New York Giants versus Buffalo, at Denver versus Philadelphia, at Houston versus Tennessee, at New York Jets, at Miami. New Orleans at Indianapolis versus New York Giants versus Tennessee, at Washington, bye week, at Houston versus Carolina, at Tampa Bay versus Detroit versus Jacksonville, at Atlanta. New York Giants, at Philadelphia, at Dallas, or versus Dallas, at New Orleans, at Tampa Bay versus New England, bye week, at Washington versus New York Jets, at Miami versus Carolina, at Minnesota versus Philadelphia. New York Jets. Versus Washington, at New England, at Oakland versus Jacksonville, versus Buffalo, at Houston versus Miami, at New York Giants versus Tennessee, at Dallas versus New England, at Buffalo. Oakland Raiders, bye week, at San Diego versus New York Jets, at Pittsburgh versus Minnesota, at Detroit, at Tennessee versus Kansas City, at Denver versus Green Bay versus San Diego, at Kansas City. Philadelphia versus New York Giants, at Carolina, bye week, at Dallas versus Miami versus Tampa Bay, at Detroit, at New England, at Buffalo versus Buffalo versus Arizona versus Washington, at New York Giants. Pittsburgh Steelers versus Arizona, at Kansas City versus Cincinnati, Oakland, Cleveland, at Seattle versus Indy, at Cincinnati versus Denver, at Baltimore, at Cleveland. St. Louis Rams versus Cleveland versus San Francisco, at Minnesota versus Chicago, at Baltimore, at Cincinnati versus Arizona, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, at Seattle, and at San Francisco. San Diego Chargers, at Green Bay versus Oakland, at Baltimore versus Chicago, bye week versus Jacksonville, or versus Kansas City, at Jacksonville, at Denver, at Kansas City versus Miami, at Oakland versus Denver. San Francisco 49ers versus Baltimore versus Seattle, at St. Louis versus Atlanta, bye week, at Seattle versus Arizona, at Chicago, at Cleveland versus Cincinnati, at Detroit versus St. Louis. Seattle Seahawks versus Carolina, at San Francisco, at Dallas, bye week versus Arizona, San Francisco, and Pittsburgh, at Minnesota, at Baltimore versus Cleveland versus St. Louis, at Arizona. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, bye week, at Washington, at Arizona, or not Arizona, at Atlanta versus New York Giants versus Dallas, at Philadelphia, at Indianapolis versus Atlanta versus New Orleans, at St. Louis versus Chicago, at Carolina. Tennessee Titans versus Miami versus Atlanta, at Houston, at New Orleans versus Carolina, at Jacksonville versus Oakland versus Jacksonville, at New York Jets, at New England versus Houston, at Indianapolis. Washington Redskins are at New York Jets versus Tampa Bay, bye week, at New England versus New Orleans, at Carolina versus New York Giants versus Dallas, at Chicago versus Buffalo, at Philadelphia, and at Dallas. And those are the remainder of schedules. Next up, we have points for and allowed and records. Arizona's record is 4-1, 190 points, scored 90 allowed. Atlanta is 5-1, 183 scored, 143 allowed. Baltimore 1-4, 123 scored, 137 allowed. Buffalo 3-2, 124 scored, 105 allowed. Carolina 4-0, 108 scored, 71 allowed. Chicago, 2-3, 86 scored, 142 allowed. Cincinnati, 5-0, 148 scored, 101 allowed. Cleveland, 2-3, 118 scored, 132 allowed. Dallas, 2-3, 101 scored, 131 allowed. Denver, 5-0, 113 scored, 79 allowed. Detroit, 0-5, 83 scored, 138 allowed. Green Bay, 5-0, 137 scored, 81 allowed. Houston, 1-4, 97 scored, 135 allowed. Indy, 3-2, 99 scored, 113 allowed. Jacksonville, 1-4, 93 scored, 145 allowed. Kansas City, 1-4, 117 scored, 143 allowed. Miami, 1-3, 65 scored, 101 allowed. Minnesota is 2-2, 80 scored, 73 allowed. New England, 4-0, 149 scored, 76 allowed. New Orleans, 2-4, 134 scored, 164 allowed. New York Giants, 3-2, 132 scored, 109 allowed. New York Jets, 3-1, 95 scored, 55 allowed. Oakland, 2-3, 107 scored, 124 allowed. Philadelphia, 2-3, 117 scored, 103 allowed. Pittsburgh, 3-2, 120 scored, 95 allowed. San Francisco, 2-3, 84 scored, 113 allowed. St. Louis, 2-3, 84 scored, 113 allowed. San Diego, 2-3, 116 scored, 134 allowed. San Francisco, 1-4, 75 scored, 140 allowed. Seattle, 2-3, 111 scored, 98 allowed. Tampa Bay, 2-3, 110 scored, and 148 allowed. Tennessee, 1-3, 102 scored, 91 allowed. Washington, 2-3, 97 scored, and 104 allowed. This has been John Ray Rice for NFL Overdrive. Thank you for watching. Please comment and like us on Facebook at Pigskin Fanatics. Bye, adios, and God bless.